Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 8.2. This lecture will be focusing on Congress, but thinking about both the legislative process and how that has changed, but also about explaining why members of Congress behave and vote the way they do. So we're going to explain the legislative process, thinking about how these institutional constraints affect decision-making, and the effects of political polarization on the legislative process. So we can't talk about legislation and legislative process without doing our obligatory viewing of I'm Just a Bill. So we'll start here.
As your body grows bigger,
your mind must flower.
It's great to learn,
'cause knowledge is power.
It's Schoolhouse Rocky, the chip off the block of your favorite Schoolhouse Rock.
I'm just a bill.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will. But today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
So this video that you've probably seen a million times before gives us a good account of what we can call the kind of classical model of the legislative process. So any member of Congress can introduce a piece of legislation, though the Constitution does require that revenue bills have to begin in the House of Representatives. But anyone can write up a bill and introduce it to Congress to consider. Then the bill is referred to a particular committee in consultation with the parliamentarian, the rules expert. They determine the appropriate committee or subcommittee that they're going to refer the bill to. In committee, there are hearings on the bill that from learned testimony from experts, concerned citizens, government agencies, etc., all try to figure out, like, is this bill a good idea? They might make amendments or changes in the markup process. And ultimately, the committee then votes whether or not to advance the bill out of committee and refer it to a full vote on the floor or not. For the bill to advance the floor in the House, the Rules Committee determines the rules for debating the bill and the types of amendments that can happen. The Senate doesn't have a Rules Committee, but the Senate has unlimited speaking time to represent its role as a deliberative body, and that means that anyone can talk as long as they want to. And so you have this idea of the origins of the filibuster are in this unlimited speaking time, this deferential to the senators, that every Senate should be able to, that every bill should be subject to the potential for unlimited debate. There is a rule of a cloture vote, which is a vote of 60 or 3/5 of the Senate to close debate on the bill and advance it to a floor vote. But this means that if there is a filibuster, that the requirement for the vote moves from a majority to a supermajority. Otherwise, a bill passes based on a basic majority vote. During the debate, additional amendments may be added. There might be additional kind of changes to the bill during this debate. And the bill must pass both houses in identical forms. If not, it goes to a conference committee in which members of both houses sort out differences in the bill so that it then goes back to both houses to pass the identical form of the bill. It then advanced to the president's desk, and the president has 10 days to either veto the bill, sending it back to Congress, or to sign it. If he fails to do so by the end of 10 days, it becomes a law. Unless Congress isn't in session, and then you have what's known as a pocket veto, and when the president holds on to the bill for 10 days, but Congress isn't in session, so he ends up vetoing it without actually vetoing it. Congress can then override the veto through both houses voting a 2/3 vote to override the president's veto. Now that is the kind of idealized form. It's not how legislation works anymore. Part of it is the shift to the filibuster threat. That what is no longer, we kind of have this idea of the talking filibuster that you would get up and debate and kind of hopefully delay or change people's mind based on this principle of unlimited debate. But now all that is needed is the threat of a filibuster rather than an actual filibuster, essentially moving the amount of votes that you need up to 60 rather than 51. And in 1974, the Budget and Impoundment Control Act gave Congress a mechanism for passing large, all-encompassing budget bills. And this means that Congress can pass what are known as omnibus bills, a large budget bill with additional piece of legislative action attached to it that must be voted up or down as a whole. And these two factors combined, plus rising polarization, means that legislation doesn't really pass except through omnibus bills. So let's think about the reasoning here. If in a highly polarized, divided Congress, if the requirement to pass anything controversial becomes 60 votes instead of 50, it's very unlikely that you're going to get people to vote against their party to overcome the 60 vote threshold. And that means any pieces of legislation are unlikely to pass the Senate unless there is another reason to unless they are packaged together with a bill to keep the government open. The most recent round of COVID relief passed at the end of the Trump administration was bound together with an omnibus fund appropriations bill that kept the government from running out of money. And so because people aren't going to vote usually to shut down the government, they will end up voting for these pieces of legislation that would have gotten filibustered. So instead of having the normal legislative process, you have this kind of nothing happens until there's a crisis, and then all the legislation that should have been debated and passed earlier gets snuck into these omnibus bills. And so you have a very, very dysfunctional legislative process. We also have the idea of copycat legislation. Lobbying firms create model legislation that they then go to members of Congress and they say, here's this piece of legislation, you should introduce it. This is more of an issue at state governments and local governments, but it still happens in the federal government. So we don't have this idea of a bunch of concerned citizens that call their member of Congress, their member of the House, who then writes a bill to solve the problem. That doesn't really happen anymore in the way that that cartoon envisions it. So why do representatives and senators vote the way that they do? Well, we can think in terms of our principles of rationality, that representatives and senators are responding to multiple constituencies, that they are trying to by all of these other people, all of these different constituencies. So they have their states if they're senators, or their districts if they are members of the House, and they are trying to get reelected. Every member of Congress has a proximate goal of getting reelected, right? And so they want to appease their members, the members of their district or their state, and so they want to be responsive to the interests of their states. But they're also responsive to interest groups and donors who are going to fund their reelection campaigns, right? Because they want to get reelected. So they have to balance the interests of their constituents versus the interests of donors. So not every constituent is equal. But they also have to balance the needs of the party organization that they are responsive to. They want to advance in the party. They want the party to help campaign for them. They want to get the party to bring up their own pieces of legislation for votes. So that means that they might vote on party lines for a piece of legislation that is less conducive to their own district, so that the party will support them in a different piece of legislation that's better for their district. They're also responsive to leadership in Congress. Their party leadership, the committee leadership, the leadership of the opposition, all are going to influence what bills get brought up. And finally, they also have, especially in a world of cable news and 24-hour news cycles, there are media and national considerations, right? Especially if you're a member of the House and you have eyes running for governor or a Senate, you need to think about not just your own district, but the state as a whole. Or if you want to run for president, or if you want to get a big piece of legislation passed, that a lot of these issues become nationalized, and so you have a nationwide constituency to consider. And they have their own agendas and aspirations. So they are always trying to balance their self-interest against all of these multiple constituencies. And this gets compounded by polarization. In one of your readings for this week, this piece by Harbridge and Malhotra, they're looking at how the composition of different districts really matters. And so they find that this is on page 499 of that reading, that where voters who are strong partisans may not want their co-partisan representative to compromise his or her beliefs in order to reach agreement with the other party, people less attached to or aligned with the political party may believe that compromise and collaboration are the basis of effective government. Hence, the composition of the individual voters' underlying district preferences should lead some members to engage in behavior contributing to party conflict and others to engage in bipartisan behavior. And they run both through kind of both experimentally and through just regressions on voting data and polling data. They find that representatives that represent more strongly partisan districts tend to be less bipartisan in memberships, in districts that are less partisan, their representatives are less partisan, right? It's because they're responding to the particular polarization of their district. But this creates a few implications, because they find in their survey experiments that even though members of Congress are responding to the partisan cues of their constituents, that this hurts the reputation of Congress as a whole, right? That more partisan conflict makes Congress look worse as a whole. But strong Democrats and strong Republicans actually approved of the members less when told they voted for the opposing party. So they end up you get punished by your strong partisan constituents if you reach across the aisle, even though as a whole, reaching across the aisle is good for the reputation of Congress as a whole. So this creates a paradox, they conclude, that voters' displeasure with discord in Congress as a macro-level institution is due to their support of those same behaviors performed at the micro-level by members of that institution. Simply put, citizens disapprove of Congress because it's composed of officials with characteristics they like. That when you're talking about your own representative, you don't want them to compromise with the other team. But when you're talking about Congress in the abstract, you're like, everyone should compromise more. Everyone should be more bipartisan. And so this paradox kind of drives more polarizing and more partisan behavior in Congress. And so this then gets added to institutional designs here. Sarah Binder, in a piece called Legislating in Polarized Times from 2016, says that we have to look at the institutional rules plus polarization is going to shape congressional behavior. So we have this shrinking political center, increased polarization, which makes it harder and harder for big pieces of legislation to get passed because there's less space to compromise. You're afraid of alienating your political base or getting primaried by a stronger member of your own party, so you're less likely to compromise. And then when you have this division into a bicameral system where every piece of legislation has to not only get through one polarized chamber, but two polarized chamber, you're going to have increasing levels of gridlock. So it's these combination of these institutional rules like bicameral legislatures, like the filibuster, like the committee system, all like supermajorities for certain types of legislation that is going to end up that those institutional rules were intended to slow the pace of legislation, but when you have polarization that drives deadlock up and brings legislation to a creeping halt. She concludes, when elections yield more polarized and partisan parties and chambers, bargaining is more difficult and compromise more frequently out of reach. Finally, we can look at work by political scientists that ran a field experiment. This is also work by Harbridge and Alexandra Philandra, in which they divided, in this field experiment, they divided respondents into two groups, and for one group they were all Republicans in this experiment, and one group they had a Republican leader who supported Trump over Trump's revelation of classified intelligence on Islamic State activity in Syria, and the other group, the treatment effect was they were shown a Republican leader who criticized Trump. Now, what ends up happening is that the treatment had no effect on support for Trump, but it had significant effect on support for the party leadership. So the fact that the senator rebuked Trump or supported Trump didn't change what people thought about Trump, but what it did, it suggested that, and that they wouldn't change their vote in the general election, they'd still vote Republican, but they said that they would be more likely to support a third part or a primary challenge of that senator, that their support for that senator in the primary dropped from 88% to 77% if they criticized Trump. And so we can see that there's a fear of being primaried by more ideological extremes of your party that drives polarized behavior in members of Congress, and that you're less likely to reach across the aisle because you're afraid of someone in your district running against you from further to the right or further to the left. And so you have with these institutional rules that make it very difficult to pass legislation in highly divided legislatures, there's no incentive to reach across the aisle electorally. So how could we solve this? In one of the supplementary in one of the readings from Anderson, Butler, and Harbridge Young, they suggest that what we should have are private negotiations, and so letting members of Congress negotiate the bills not in public committee hearings, not on the floor, but privately, so that they can kind of reach a compromise and then go public with what that compromise is. So that would still allow for public accountability, and so that they could voters could punish or reward based on what the contents of that compromise are, but not how they got to it. So you don't have to have kind of who supported what at the initial stages. You just have here's this piece of legislation that we came together, this compromise piece of legislation that we came to after private negotiations. So no one actually sees who compromised with what or who voted where on forming the legislation, just on whether or not they supported the legislation up or down when it actually gets proposed. So these private negotiations, hopefully, they suggest, could negotiate or could insulate senators and representatives from the threat of a primary challenge. And so what we're going to think about in discussion section, one of the things we're going to think about in discussion section this week is, are there downsides to this strategy of kind of private negotiations? And do you think that this would help solve polarization? Do you think this is an effective strategy to give kind of cover for people to negotiate and compromise and avoid the threat of a primary challenge. So that's it for this week on Congress. Next week, we're looking at the executive branch. We're looking at the presidency and the bureaucracy, both parts of the executive branch, thinking about what the president does and what the executive agencies do. The minute paper question for this week, again, you can always go to bit.ly/P101MP or Pols101 MPQ and answer the following minute paper question. How do you think Madison from the Federalist Papers, selections from the Federalist Papers that I discussed in the first lecture, would assess the current state of Congress? Do you think that his defense of its institutional design still holds up today? Do you think that the kind of justifications that Madison gives for a bicameral legislature still hold up? Or do you think it's time that we need more serious institutional reform? So that's it for this lecture and this week on Congress. I'll see you in discussion section. Have a good one.